So you're probably thinking, wait, didn't they tell her she's not supposed to use notes? She's not supposed to be at the podium. She's supposed to be like dancing and getting your attention. No, I'm not going to do that. And I'll tell you why. A lot of my current research is on students with disabilities. How many of you in this room are seeing the folks up here on stage and thinking, I don't think I could do that. I couldn't talk without notes. I couldn't be that engaging. Raise your hand if you think, maybe I couldn't do that. All right, so I'm standing here partially for you and partially because I want to send the message that just because I might do it a little differently doesn't mean that I'm not doing it, right? And just because I'm going to deliver my message differently doesn't mean that my message isn't important. As a matter of fact, if you think my message is only important if I'm like moving around the stage and probably tripping because I'm a klutz, then that's not the point, right? So I love that the last speaker talked about listening to people's stories. And so I'm here with notes because my story is on my notes. I know how to best tell my story. I know how to best deliver a talk. And so I'm going to do it that way. I'm going to buck the system. So the title of my talk is on the screen in front of you. And so they gave me 10 to 12 minutes. So 10 to 12 minutes, I thought, that's enough time for social justice, right? Absolutely. And so every time I sat down to write this talk, I thought, what can I possibly say in 10 to 12 minutes that actually matters? Could I do justice to social justice? And the answer is probably not. So I ultimately decided to share 6 lessons with you from my own journey. What have I learned? What might be useful? And I hope they're useful to you. Before I start, though, let me situate myself in this talk. I'm an individual with a lot of privileges by my race, my ability, my social class, and my age. I'm also a tenured associate professor. That position comes with an awful lot of power and privilege. But I also speak to you from 2 minoritized social identities as a queer cisgender woman. So here are my 6 lessons. First is that we have never arrived. The day that any of us think that we are done challenging ourselves to grow and learn and be more socially just is the day we probably need to get out of this profession, me included. That might sound really harsh, but I think all of you got into this field because you want to support all students. And we can't do that unless we're doing it inclusively. And we can't be inclusive unless we got our shit together with social justice. And it's a long, ongoing process. We have never arrived. Number 2, and these aren't in any particular order, they're just in my random brain order, is be intentional with your messaging. We have a giant role to play in the messages that we send on our college campuses, in our offices, in our departments, and the images that we use, the words that we use, the language that we use matters. So there's a conference room on my campus, and ironically, we have an awful lot of diversity committee meetings in there. And that conference room is lined with images of older white men in big giant frames. They're enormous. And so I walk into there and I sit down at the conference table and I think, I don't belong here. Right? The message that I get is that I do not belong in that space, or people like me don't belong in that space. So I think we need to think about our messaging every moment of every day. And I'll give you an example. I did that for this talk. I know that a TED Talk is supposed to include beautiful images and engaging pictures. And then I thought, how often the media and our college campuses use images that are exclusionary. And so I thought, I don't want to do that. If I picked pictures of human beings for a talk on social justice, who would be left out? Would I have enough slides to include everyone? No. How would I represent social identities that aren't visible? So some of our disabilities, sexuality. And even if I could find images of someone with an LGBT rights button, wouldn't we just be tokenizing them or assuming their identity for them? Right? We wouldn't really know their identity. My other option was to use these. How many of you have gone to a diversity or social justice presentation with some kind of images where you've seen images like this? Okay, all right. I hesitate to use these messages. We are not smiling cartoon figures. We are not multicultural stick figures. That is not us. We are human beings who experience oppression and privilege every day. And when the impact of oppression could be lack of access, but beyond that, intense emotional distress, bodily harm, or death, these images hardly seem appropriate. They say that we're not taking this real seriously. Lesson 3. We need to learn from our isms. Every single one of us in this room has done or said something that's exclusionary, probably in the last 24 hours. And this is especially the case when we come from our places of privilege. But I would argue that we need to learn from our isms. We need to recognize it, admit it, and learn from it. And this might include being able to accept feedback with grace. And that's hard. When someone challenges a decision, a perspective, or something that we've done that is exclusionary, our initial reaction is to come up with a perfectly legitimate explanation or excuse. Right? We want to tell them how we didn't mean it, or that wasn't our intention. We have a perfectly legitimate reason for the language or the decision or the perspective. But I want to tell you that when we do that, when we use a PLE, we dishonor the person who challenged us. Yeah, I see some head nodding. That might have happened to you, right? We dishonor that person. We invalidate the experiences of people who are oppressed. And most importantly, we send the message that we are not willing to learn. And we are not willing to grow from our mistakes. But this shit is hard. That's our gut reaction, PLE. But if you want to be really inclusive, we have to really think about taking that feedback with grace. So some of you might be thinking right about this moment, well, no one's ever given me feedback that I'm not inclusive, so I must be really inclusive. If you're having your conversation in your head right now about that, I want you to think that there might be 2 reasons why you're not getting feedback. One is there's an awful lot of power probably in your position or your role. Or people just perceive that you're not going to take that feedback with grace or not learn from it, and so it's not worth their breath or time. So I want you to think about, if you don't get feedback, it might be because your students, your colleagues, you might have some power over their grades, their performance evaluations, frankly, their livelihood. And so sometimes people don't give us feedback if they don't perceive we're open to it or that we have some power over them. And sometimes, those of us from minoritized social identity groups, we don't challenge you because it's frankly exhausting. If we challenged every instance of oppression every single day, that's all we would do, right? So my last lesson was taking feedback with grace, but it leads into this one. It's our jobs to challenge ourselves every day. Our jobs, no one else's, to get on this journey and keep moving along. Yes, sometimes we're going to be challenged by others, but we should not have to rely on external agents to help us learn and grow. As a matter of fact, too often, those of us with privilege ask folks from minoritized social identity groups to be our educators. How many of you have been asked to be an educator? I joke sometimes on my campus that it feels like I have a flashing rainbow above my office door, right? People come to me and ask me for the queer perspective on just about anything, even if it has nothing to do with my job or my identity, right? I become the educator. And so, don't do that. It's tokenizing, it's culturally taxing, and quite frankly, it's a form of oppression. One of the ways you can work on your own shit, I said the 4-letter word, whoop, whoop. One of the ways we can do that is to use the NASPA and ASHE professional competencies. They're actually pretty good, especially the social justice and inclusion competency. The foundational levels basically ask you to work on your own shit. Dig deep. What are your biases? What are your privileges? What are the assumptions that you make? What have you gotten wrong, and what have you gotten right? These are fantastic competencies, and they can help. But I want to tell you that engaging in this deep reflection kind of what's not working is hard. This stuff is hard, and it's easier not to do, and if you have privilege, you don't have to do it. But if you want to be a more socially just educator, you have to do it. We all do. How many of you want to be an ally or hope you're an ally? Raise your hand. Okay. So you can't be an effective ally unless you work on your stuff. So let me tell you a story about the best ally I've ever had. I'm going to use pseudonyms. Her name was Chandra. She was a student. And she was in my diversity and cultural competence class. And so I have to set up the scenario. So I teach this class, and I set it up in boardroom style or circle so that students are kind of facing each other. And for the first 4 weeks of the semester, a student, let's call him John, he sat right next to me. He identified as a black man, and he was incredibly passionate about racism and classism, and he was excited to be in the class, and he was engaged with his peers, and he was engaged with me, and super excited to be there. At the end of week 4, I foreshadowed the topic for week 5. I always do that before the end of class and say, next week we're going to talk about. And the topic for week 5 was sexuality. And so I introduced the topic, and I came out to my class, which I do. I believe it's important to be visible. Week 5, John came into the class, and John took the seat at the farthest spot away from me that he possibly could. He physically removed himself from me. And I was kind of at a loss. So Chandra, luckily, I had planned some small group discussions that day. Chandra sat next to him in a small group, and I could hear her saying things like, you know, when I grew up, I learned a lot of homophobic messages from my family. And my religion taught me to be pretty homophobic and transphobic, but then I realized my religion was actually about love and compassion, and I was just not really realizing what the potential of my religion could be. So she had this conversation with him that I could never have had. Not at least that day, right? Because I was kind of stunned. She was my best ally. And she was an incredible ally because she had done her work. She had unlearned all those homophobic and transphobic messages on her own, not because it was a class assignment or I told her she had to do it. She did it because she knew that it was her duty to support all students, and that included LGBT students, and so she was doing the hard work. And she admitted it was hard. My last message, and I know I'm out of time, lesson 6, is that it's important to role model inclusion. How many of you hope to be a role model for your students and your colleagues? Okay. So we have to role model inclusion every single day. And so there have been many cases where I have stopped a class or come to the next class and said, I'm going to own the language, the decision, or the behavior that I made last time as oppressive. And sometimes students are frankly pretty shocked. Holy shit, the professor she just admitted that she did something that was really oppressive. But you know what they learned from that? Is that this is a journey. It's a lifelong journey, and this stuff is hard. And if we learn from our mistakes, that's what's important. So here's a quote from one of my end of semester evaluations from a student who's anonymous. I don't know who wrote it, but she said, the professor modeled the multicultural competencies that we need to assess and develop in ourselves. Thank you for modeling the passion and demonstrating the behavior of the professional and advocate I hope to be. This was the best comment I've ever received, because it's important to model this. We have to show our students how to do it, and sometimes that means exposing ourselves. And there are no shortage of opportunities to do that. So thanks for allowing me to share my 6 lessons. I hope that they're useful to you, and have a great day.